Thank you all very much for being here for a very special afternoon or evening, wherever you happen to might be. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are broadcasting from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Innuak, and Shinanu, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. It would be churlish of me not to start off with a great note of gratitude. This evening is made entirely possible by Raincoast Books and Bloomsbury Publishing. We couldn't have done this without them, and we're so very thankful that they thought of us to host this event. And we're so very grateful that you're joining us here, either in the Zoom webinar or later on YouTube to watch this video. We are here, of course, with one of the greatest fiction minds of his generation, as per Rolling Stone, the New York Times best-selling author and legendary storyteller, Alan Moore. In the interest of full disclosure, I've been a reader of Moore for decades and have been consistently astonished by his ability to fold the most arcane subjects into his work in such an incredibly approachable, brilliant, and forever mind-expanding way. He's expanded my horizons enormously, and in his literary works over the past decade and beyond, that has just grown a thousandfold. So we're particularly thrilled to be here to discuss The Great When, which is, of course, the first book of five, and a thrilling and utterly intoxicating book, the first in his long London quintet that dives into the occult underworld of London in Moore's inimitable style. I won't take up much more time as we do want to get to the meat of the event. I just have a few quick notes as to how today will go. There'll be a conversation hosted by McNally Robinson's own Matthew Montgomery, and after that there'll be an opportunity for all of you here in the webinar to ask questions. You'll notice there is a Q&A button, so feel free to write your questions in there. The only thing we will gently request is that you limit your questions particularly to the Great When and his literary output this afternoon, as that is exactly what we are here to discuss. But now I will turn the stage over to our host and our special guest. Our host, Matthew Montgomery, is a bookseller working on Treaty 1 territory. Matthew has a bachelor's degree in English, BA Hons, and a Master of Arts in Cultural Studies, an MA from the University of Winnipeg. He has three cats and far too many books at home. Some of you may be familiar with our glorious special guest this afternoon, Alan Moore. Alan is widely regarded as the best and most influential writer in the history of comics. He is also the author of the best-selling Jerusalem, which is a masterpiece, and the short story collection Illuminations. He was born in Northampton, England, and has lived there ever since. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Montgomery and Alan Moore.
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome, everybody. I just wanted to show off that we are celebrating The Great When, which is for sale right now. It is fantastic. I read it pretty much in two sittings. It's very propulsive and funny and a very fun romp. And yeah, I'm very excited to discuss it. Something that John said in the introduction that kind of ties into one of my first questions is that he said that you take arcane subjects and make them approachable for folks. And I think that's true. While simultaneously, you do ask a lot of your readers. You ask them to follow your trail of breadcrumbs, and you ask them to work through the labyrinth sentences and the beautiful prose. And I wondered, do you think that is a conscious effort to kind of resist the monoculture of kind of ordinary consumption? Or is it just something that you do unconsciously and you're happy to do and you're very good at
No, I think it is part of my evil plan.
it?
It's my belief that words do something to us. Language does something to us. I mean, nobody has any problem accepting George Orwell's idea that in 1984, where he's got his Newspeak, where if you limit the number of words in a language, then that will diminish the amount of concepts that people can actually think. But I've got no problem accepting that. I think you only have to look at, I mean, most of our tabloid newspapers. I think that they need a vocabulary of something like, is it 10,000 words? Which is tiny.
Mhm.
But if that's true, then the converse has got to be true. That if you expand people's vocabularies, if you expand the number of things that they can conceive of or think, then you're going to kind of expand their consciousness rather than limit it. So that has always been my intention. I kind of I got where I am today, wherever that is, by reading things that were slightly too smart for me and having to sort of bluff it, mainly so that I could appear more intelligent than I was to the people around me. So it was all probably done for reasons of pretentiousness to begin with, but it certainly served me very well because I found that even if I could only understand 80% of, say, a Slavoj Žižek book, then that is still enormously more than I understood when I started it. So, yeah, I do try to both entertain and stretch the reader. Because if you're just making something that's challenging and that people aren't going to actually enjoy, then it's not going to work. You've sabotaged yourself before you've started. So I believe in trying to make everything as incredibly enjoyable for the reader as I can do, but it's not enough to entertain them. It has to be about something. It has to be telling them something, giving them some information they can use, you know.
Yeah, without being didactic or without being too didactic, you give them the sweet and the kind of the medicine at the same time.
Yeah, well, I think that that's probably the best way to educate people. I have my issues with the education system, but I think that normally people, particularly young people, particularly children, they're like sponges. The problem is stopping them from absorbing information. That is what they are naturally put on the earth to do. I think our education systems perhaps tend to make learning into something that is monotonous and is drudgery, and it makes people associate learning with drudgery. And it makes them associate not learning with pleasure, which is not really the case. So I think that if we can just make information, if you can just shape the information in a way that is irresistible, by using the right words, by touching the right triggers in people's sense of language. You
Mhm.
can, I think that with a well-written book, then I think that that is still the most powerful form of virtual reality that we are ever likely to develop. Um, there's something about language that it permeates everything that we are. It permeates the entire world.
Mhm.
And, so you can hopefully use that to give your readers a really enriching and inviting experience.
My next question is about our wonderfully named protagonist, Dennis Knuckleyard. And maybe for those that haven't read all the way through the book yet, you could say where that wonderful name came from.
Well, it came from, and this is very rare. I know that a lot of writers talk as if this kind of happens to them all the time, that they'll wake up in the middle of the night with a great idea and write it down. This has never happened to me, except probably a couple of years ago. I was just drifting off to sleep, and I was kind of swimming through all of that hypnagogic sludge that we tend to embark upon before we're fully unconscious. And there was just rubbish flowing through my head, just word salad, random phrases that came from nowhere. And in amongst them, there was the phrase. So anyway, then Dennis Knuckleyard, at which point I sat bolt upright in bed laughing because I had never heard a name anywhere near as ridiculous as that before, and yet it was somehow compelling. Um, so when the time came to write this quintet of fantasy novels, when I was looking for a name for the protagonist, I really didn't have to look far. And also, I've checked around, and apparently there has never been anyone or anything in the entire world that has been called Knuckleyard. Um, you know, you put that into a search engine, well, after the Great When there'll be results, but
Yeah.
before this, nothing. So yeah, that was where it came from, and as if to demonstrate that this is probably the only time in my life that this will happen. Um, the other night, I also remembered a phrase as I was drifting off to sleep. It was in an Australian accent, and it was saying, "Scorpions, usually you keep them in the toilet," which is obviously, I'm not going to be turning that into a quintet of novels anytime soon. So I think I lucked out with Dennis Knuckleyard.
Good. It's something that I really enjoyed when meeting Dennis Knuckleyard, other than the fact that he is kind of a awkward uh, teenager, is that he's not the usual middle class protagonist that kind of gets involved in what Brian Aldiss called cozy catastrophes. He is definitely of the lower classes, and that's a breath of fresh air considering how bougie and middle class fantasy is.
Well, thank you very much for noticing that. That was for me one of the main sort of planks of the whole series. And in discussing other possibilities for the Great When with people, that is the thing that I've insisted on, that the class perspective remains accurate. Because otherwise, you could be forgiven for thinking that it's only middle class children who get to wander through the back of the wardrobe and into Narnia. There are exceptions. I think that the writer Alan Garner, who is one of the best children's writers of all time, in my opinion. But there is a working class perspective in his stories. But otherwise, I think that all of literature, not just fantasy, but for the most part, literature is entirely for and about the middle classes. Nothing against the middle class, some of my best friends. But it seems a bit uh, uneven, to say the very least, when less and less working class people are being encouraged to write or to become artists or filmmakers. And although there is occasionally some talk about leveling this up, um, it's really never going to happen because, unlike with other minorities, um, with women, with gay people, with trans people, with people of color, um, and of course, the advances that have been made with all of those groups of people are to be welcomed, are necessary. But the thing is, it's easier with those groups to appear to do something about it. Whereas if you do something about leveling up financial inequality between people, then you are pretty much destroying the entire foundation upon which capitalism is standing. So that must never happen, apparently. Um, so at least in the domain of an outrageous fantasy, I can act as if working class people are actually important and have a story to tell. I mean, how unbelievable and fantastic is that? But the thing is that I actually find that by um, the working class and that low life milieu in general. It turns out such fantastic characters and such fantastic situations. Um, I suggest that you would have difficulty finding characters anywhere near as interesting as Austin Spare, Prince Monolulu, Ironfoot Jack Neve, or any of the other characters that which were the reason why I wanted to write these books. I'd got all of these low-life characters that I was fascinated by. And I thought I needed a vehicle that was big enough and outrageous enough to contain all of these outrageous stories. So, yes, that has been one of my main ambitions and directives with the whole series. I want this to be fantasy seen from below rather than from a more privileged social perspective. I think that it will perhaps feel perhaps a bit more unusual and exciting for people. If they give it a try, they might find that they like a bit of rough.
Especially when it comes to the criminal aspect. It's sometimes hard to get good stories when everybody's sitting around a drawing room just kind of chatting about their stocks and stuff. So it is nice to see street level characters engaging with the streets themselves, which does kind of lead me to my next question, which is about the the physical spaces, plural, of London, and it's very specific to London. And what I wanted to ask about kind of your research is whether or not you went the routes that Dennis Knuckleyard himself does to as he's trying to get rid of this book. If you walked it yourself, or is it just from memory?
This is entirely from memory and maps and imagination. There was a time when I was a strict disciple of the Ian Sinclair method of psychogeography, which he describes as walking with an agenda. And there is an awful lot to be had from actually going out and physically investigating these sites. Unfortunately, I don't walk very much at all these days. I am far less mobile than I used to be. So, but luckily, I find that I can do much the same job by using what I think the CIA probably refer to as remote viewing. This is where if you've just got a street map and an imagination and some memories of the places concerned, uh, then you can generally do a more credible job than somebody who actually lives in the area who probably doesn't pay any attention to it and doesn't notice it. So that's how I've been guiding Dennis through the streets in the book so far. It's purely by squinting at an A to Z, um, and sometimes looking at maps of the actual period so that I can see if how much things have changed. Um, and yeah, the rest of it is all just putting yourself into the character and then having their experience and then writing about it. It's yeah, it's probably quite a lot like remote viewing, you know. But yeah, so at one time I would have gone out and actually walked to these places. And I mean, like in the second book, which I'm doing at the moment, there's a lot of bit about Highbury, uh, where when I was doing my Highbury working CD and performance piece, I actually went out with my late friend and mentor, Steve Moore, and we walked up and down Holloway Road and actually checked out the site on the ground and And that was invaluable because you find details that aren't mentioned in graffiti, transient things that nevertheless seem to have great meaning. So if you can do that, yes, I would advise get out there and have a look at what the territory is like when you're on the ground. But if you can't, then you'll probably find that books and maps and a bit of imagination will probably suffice.
It's interesting that you mentioned the graffiti and other transient things because something that's really interesting about this book is how the texture of it is made up of kind of the pop cultural ephemera of the past. And you do such a great job kind of weaving together pop culture that, say, me, a Canadian living, in the modern era would recognize, but also some deep cuts that required me to do a little bit of research on my phone while I was reading. And that leads to my question about kind of how you balance that nostalgia, if you will, for that kind of period, because I mean, it would be remiss of me to say that it's junk culture because obviously I'm breathing the same stuff that you are and loving it. So, how do we balance in the Long London that nostalgia, but at the same time being at least a little bit responsible about how things did kind of suck post Blitz?
Well, I mean, I don't think I'm being nostalgic. I mean, I was born in 1953. I remember very little of the 1950s. Um, it was, I remember that the 1950s were largely brown and indoors. But that is my major impression. Uh, Nevertheless, I grew up amongst the rubble, both physical and psychological, of the Second World War. The war was only a few years in the past, and everyone was still talking about it. It had changed everything. Uh, so it's not a nostalgia for those times. It's wanting to create the texture of them so that people reading it today, many of whom, most of whom, wouldn't have been alive in those times, or may have been in different countries where they didn't experience things exactly the same way that we did in England. Um, it's wanting to give modern readers a sense of the texture and feel and atmosphere of the past as much as I can. I am going out of my way to find things that aren't around anymore. You'll notice that I spend quite a lot of time describing an old-fashioned English phone box that smelled of old-fashioned English urine and had the huge yellow pages and directories sort of probably changed to a shelf. And it's things that these days are on the verge of vanishing or have vanished because they've been superseded. Um, I think in the first book, there's a mention that, yes, we do have the television, as it was called. No one ever spoke about having television. It was like they had the television. I suppose it's a bit like the internet or something like that. But yeah, so we got the first ever comedy show. I happened to see that that had gone out the week before Austin Osman Spare had his pub exhibition in one of the closing chapters. So uh, I, throughout the five books, I want to chart the development of that culture. Um, there is there are films that are mentioned, mainly The Third Man in the first book. But in the second book, we're talking about other films from the 1950s, they're a developing kind of phenomenon. We've got the same thing with music and also with, say, like Black Identity, 1949. That was about a year after the Windrush had first arrived. So yes, there were West Indian people coming into Britain, into London, but there weren't that many of them. Um, by the next book, 1959, you've got a much larger number coming in who are being crammed into horrible accommodation in Notting Hill by the slum landlord Peter Rackman. This leads to the Notting Hill riots of 1958, which would ultimately lead to the Notting Hill Carnival as an attempt to counteract the violence of the riots. All of these are developing things: the politics, the queer identity, um, the way that women are regarded, the music, the films, the television shows, television itself, which is like hardly a thing in 1949. By 1959, most people are renting a television set. Um, so in this way, I can hopefully give a kind of a story of England um, in the last 50 years of the 20th century that will be able to say something. Uh, I'm not quite sure what I'm saying yet, but it feels like a developing thesis to me.
Hmm. And this impulse to kind of bring back the past and make it living and breathing, it does kind of make me think about how London itself, the physical spaces, are going to change with each volume, and how kind of the layers of London are just kind of being built on top of each other over and over again until it's this kind of like deep, deep ground thing. And I wonder if you see kind of Dennis Knuckleyard's movement through this space is kind of like rehabilitating or maybe exhuming kind of the architecture and psychogeography of this past.
Well, I wanted to make people aware of the past and aware of the richness of the past, because if we're not aware of the past, we are not aware of the present properly, because the past is how the present got here. Um, but sort of, I don't know, at the same time, having Dennis move through those different times, um, it's also to it's critical as well. It's being very, very critical of uh, of what it all means, what the changes mean. It is seeing them from a critical perspective. One of the things that actually did make it rather neat was when I was doing the little epilogue, the old man at the end, which is at the end of each book, but sort of in the first book, that is set in 1999. And when I was doing the research for 1999, which, yes, even though I lived through 1999, I can barely remember it. I certainly need to do a lot of reference to check it out and see what actually happened. But when I was doing that, I found out that 1999 was when the last of London's bomb sites was finally cleared for development.
Wow.
And I thought, that is neat. That gives a kind of a sense to the 1949, 1999 time frame of the five books. That it took that long for London to finally get rid of the physical scars of the Second World War, at least. Whether the psychological and social scars ever heal, I don't know. Um, but yeah, by taking Dennis through these 50 years, and it'll be a changing Dennis and a changing London. Um, I want it to be so that, far from nostalgic, I want it to be an examination of the last 50 years of the 20th century as a way of explaining the century that we are currently living through. Ultimately, I don't think these books, they are set in the past, but I don't think that ultimately they are about the past. I'm hoping that ultimately they are about our peculiar situation in the present. So it's using historical fantasy as a kind of subterfuge, as a way of talking obliquely about now.
That's great. You're writing about this era of London. You've written about the 20th century. You've written about the current century in Jerusalem. In your first book, you wrote about even the Paleolithic era. Is there is there a historical era of London that you would still like to tackle? Something that you've
Uh,
done yet, like the Georgian era or the Reformation?
that all of the eras of both London and, in fact, Northampton as well. But all of the eras of London are fantastic. They're full of wonderful things, wonderful details that I could easily, I'm sure, write endless novels about. However, that is a bit impractical, unless you've got the infinite monkeys and the infinite typewriters at your disposal, which I don't. So I think that with the Long London novels, I can investigate any era of London that I want, simply because in the Great When itself, in this other London, um, it's London all at once, and all of its time periods, past, present, and conceivably future, are kind of coexisting. They're all in this forever boiling and changing landscape of so that does give me the possibility of using characters from any era or landscapes from any era. It's a sneaky way of having my cake and eating it too. I can anything that I do think of, oh, that period of London, that would be really interesting, or that character, yeah, they can turn up in the Great When.
Mhm.
Um, it's the whole of London, so that includes quite a lot of stuff.
I'm trying to avoid spoilers and whatnot for those that haven't read it, but one thing that I like about this book, and kind of tying back to the discussion about the working class folks, is that Dennis's um, interaction with the other London is not simply just this was a fun trip and I'm going to go back to my regular life. It has quite a psychic impact on him and leaves him, I think, like most people would, a bit of a blubbering idiot for the first little bit after returning. And I
Mm.
thought that's a very interesting and novel way of looking at it, and probably extremely accurate.
Well, it's what I again talking about the children going through the back of the wardrobe into Narnia. Um, if any of us had even a momentary glimpse of something which we understood to be impossible, um, we would come to pieces. Those children would have been shrieking and vomiting from their first sight of Mr. Tumnus. They would be in therapy for the rest of their lives. Of course they would. We don't need much in the way of disturbed reality to completely undo us. So the idea that, yeah, the people go through the back of the wardrobe into Narnia and it's no big thing, which kind of seems to be pretty traditional for a lot of otherworld fantasy fiction, that you go into the other world and you have some adventures there and they're jolly exciting, but you are not completely on the floor and weeping at your experience. So I thought, yes, in my book, I want people to act as if the fantastic was an enormous intrusion, a brutal, intrusion into ordinary reality, because I think that generally that's what would happen. So in my book, people are, when they're coming into or coming out of the Great Wen, then they are vomiting, weeping, fainting, collapsing. It's because it would be an incredibly disturbing experience, and you'd probably never get over it. It would always be there in the back of your mind. You would be haunted. Um, I have a character in the second book talking to two characters who have been into the Great Wen and pointing out to them that there's something wrong with them. There's something noticeably funny about them because they've been somewhere a long way away, and it shows. There's a certain distance that they've got. They're never going to quite fit in to ordinary human discourse ever again, because this would be a shattering experience. I mean, this world as it is a shattering experience. Imagine if
Hmm.
there was another one.
It makes me think of the higher powers playing billiards in the middle section of Jerusalem, and the word choices you use to describe the noise of the balls hitting each other, and just how it's eardrum bursting to have this intense psychological experience and having to go back to normal life. But even the ghosts, shall we say, in Jerusalem are psychologically impacted by their own experience in this other world. And it's the same here with the Great Wen. It's kind of makes me think of how it's they can't reintegrate into normal society because of this psychological change, but you're not saying that's a bad thing. This is actually expanding. This is expanding their lives, even if there is a bit of a cost to it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a thing where I am trying to make my readers feel this as viscerally as possible. This sense of alienation. So whenever I take the characters or the readers into the Great Wen, I immediately go into italics, perhaps because they're all leaning forward and they seem to be in a bit of an urgent rush to get somewhere, that kind of gives a certain urgency. I'm not sure why it is, but italics have a sense of urgency. I also put it into the present tense, which makes it seem very immediate, as if it's really happening now. And I use Celine's three little dots that give a kind of centripetal energy to the prose. Again, it makes it rush. And I also amp up the poetry for those sections. And all in all, I want to kind of make it a little bit uncomfortable for the reader. I want so much going on that it's kind of overwhelming, which is what the characters are feeling. And also that, yes, it's thrilling, the Great Wen sections, hopefully, but I also want the readers to be glad when they're over, to suggest that this other world, it's not somewhere where you'd probably want to visit by choice unless you had to. It's a bit of a strain. And I wanted the readers to experience that a little bit, just with the overwhelming language and the italics and the present tense and everything, to give them a sense of just how destabilizing this is for the people actually having to walk through this landscape, to give them a vicarious sense of how damaging, as you say, how expanding, but not necessarily without a cost. that sort of, which I suppose is, if in some ways you could see the Great Wen as a metaphor for the imagination of London, the imaginal London. And yes, you can enter into that Great Wen, but the trick doorways that look like doors, they're all in your head. But nevertheless, yes, you can actually enter that landscape. I mean, I did in order to write about it, entirely in the imagination. And I found that a very expansive experience. But at the same time, yes, it has its wearing side. But I think my general feeling is that if you're expanding your information, if you're expanding your consciousness, even if it is a bit uncomfortable, it is almost certainly worth it. Because once you've grown into that new perspective, you will probably find the world a much richer one. You know.
It's also kind of, you were mentioning the italics themselves. There is kind of a almost a psychological relief when you finish italics and go back to regular texts. So you're mirroring the prose, the actual sentence structure with the typography itself, and that is kind of neat because I'm sure lots of people agree with me. Sometimes italics, when there's so much of it, it does become a little tiring, and then you get that
Mhm.
whew, it's done once you get to the regular
Yeah, and I'm
typography.
deliberately doing that. I am
Yeah.
deliberately trying to exhaust the reader. So that's the kind of writer you're dealing with here.
Yeah. And then I have one last question, which is about, if I remember right, I believe there's only one or two historical figures that appear both in Jerusalem and the Great Wen, and I think it's Cromwell is the only person who appears in both.
That's
And
probably true. Yeah.
I think I wanted to ask you about, we talk about the psychological scars and rubble of World War II, but do you think that England and whatnot still have psychological scars from Cromwell? Enough that
Uh,
he shows up over and over?
well, I mean, like Northampton, we tend to attract a lot of this. Um, Both of the major internal wars in Britain, in England, have ended in Northampton because we're in the middle of the country. So if you're having a war with somebody at the other end of the country, you're almost certainly going to end up having it in Northampton. So the Cromwell Civil War, we were very much on the side of Cromwell before we'd realised that he was the British Stalin, and we weren't sport for choice, really. I mean, we've got Charles I on one hand, and he was unbearable. So when Oliver Cromwell said, "I think I can get rid of him," then we all said, "Yes, good for you." And so all of the strange little Christian sects and sort of the Protestant sects that were gathering around Cromwell, they were all meeting here in the Civil War. Earlier than that, we'd had the War of the Roses conclude here in the Battle of the Calmeadow, whereas the British Civil War, that was the Battle of Naseby. And I think that, if you go out to Naseby Field, you can tell that something's happened there. I don't know, maybe it's just because something's happened there, but the atmosphere in that place is thick with the violence that occurred there once. I think that things like that tend to imprint themselves upon a landscape or imprint themselves upon human memory so that they will always be an element in our psychology. Everything that happened in the past, its wonderful things, its terrible things, that is in many senses still going on. It's like if you strike a tuning fork, in a sense, that vibration actually never ends. It just gets smaller and smaller and smaller, but it's still there in the atoms, in the molecules of a place. Uh, and I think that that informs the identity of the place and the psychologies of the people living in it. So, yes, all of the past. It's not gone. It is still there, and it is what we're living in. It is the foundations of what we're living in and how we're thinking and how we live our lives. So I think the past is to be ignored at our peril.
Mm, I agree. Well, thank you very much for answering my questions. I think I'm going to turn it over to John, and John's going to take some questions from the audience.
Yes, indeed. Thank you both very much. And thank you all for your questions thus far. We do have a shortened time period, so we won't be able to get to them all, but we will put some of them to Alan right now. So to start off, following in the themes, the magical themes of the book, Aidan points out that this is not the only Alan Moore book coming out. The Moon and Serpent Bumper Book of Magic has just been released as well after a long gestation period. Can it in some ways be seen as a deeper integration and instruction on personal practice of the magical themes that are fictionalized in The Great Wen?
I suppose so. I mean, with the Great Wen, I've tried not to make the overlap too great with the Book of Magic. Rather than relying upon magical entities, with the Great Wen, I wanted to just make them up. So things like Popes of Blades and things like that, they're just things that I've made up. Um, but there is a certain amount of overlap. We talk about Aleister Crowley and Dion Fortune and particularly Austin Spare in the first book, which certainly has, yeah, those people as covered in the Bumper Book of Magic as well. The Bumper Book of Magic is hopefully a very didactic but very enjoyable practical approach to thinking about magic. The Great Wen is a fiction. There may be some areas where characters overlap, but but they're two separate things, I think.
Right. Keeping with that theme just for a moment, Jason was wondering, regarding the fantastic being destabilizing, as you were describing, does that also connect to your own experience of magic?
I would say that probably it does. But I've always found that when I have had something uh, either supernatural or which I perceived as being supernatural happening, it is always inexplicable. It is out of the blue. It doesn't have a rational explanation. Um, it is much more like uh, David Lynch than it is about, say, uh, vampire stories, for example, where yes, the vampires are supernatural, but as long as you know all of the laws about how vampires work, they can't cross running water, they avoid garlic, all the rest of it, they can't go out in the sunlight, then you can probably work out how to kill them by rational thinking. Whereas the actual experience is much more like the kind of David Lynch world where you haven't got the first clue what is going on. There is something unearthly that has happened, and you have to deal with it, but not necessarily to understand it. So yes, there is. I'm not saying that I've had anything as dramatic as the things that happened to Dennis, because I probably wouldn't have survived them. But yes, it's building upon things that I have had, to extrapolating upon them to try and give a sense of how this would feel if it was really happening to you.
Fabulous. Mark points out that music has long been a source of inspiration for you and was wondering what music, if any, influenced the creation of The Great Wen.
I have been listening to less and less music over the last several years, well, last decade or so, because having gone deaf in one ear, um, it tends to make, if I'm listening to music, if people are talking, I can't listen to both at the same time. So I tend to exist in silence. but music is playing quite a large part in the ongoing Long London Quintet. In the first book, the the main references are to the Harry Lime theme, which was being played on pub pianos all over London in 1949. The second book, 1959, I've become very, very interested in the legendary Joe Meek, the record producer who created Telstar and who had a very, very strange life. Um, he has become a major character in the second volume, and he will also appear briefly in the third. Um, so the pop world of London is at that time is becoming interesting to me. And I mean, with the next book, of course, which is happening in the 60s, the psychedelic era, which is one of my favorite eras of music, will be taking center stage. The next book, it will be a lot more punk inflected. And the final book, the 1990s, it will reflect the fact that by the 1990s, counterculture appeared to have completely vanished and dried up. Uh, um, so, because we are marking counterculture throughout the books by the character of Maurice Callender, who is an entity. I'm not still not quite sure what Maurice Callender is, but he more or less manifests all of the passing trends in a very physical way. So yes, I shall be mapping and tracing both music and culture, and hopefully saying something about these things in the course of the 5 books.
Fabulous. And further to that, given the importance of music in the forthcoming books, Peter points out that your music pieces are fabulous and he particularly loves Highbury working. Are there any plans for any multimedia with the books as they progress at all? Anything that you'd like to explore above and beyond the page?
Well, there are possibilities. I wouldn't mind because those um recorded pieces, the Moon and Serpent albums that we made from these one-off site-specific performances, they are actually turning out to be feeding in to the narrative of the Great Wen. Like I say, the second book, a lot of it is taking place in Highbury, or at least the chapter that I've just finished. It's taking place in Highbury. It's talking about things that I talked about in the Highbury working. Um, Also, I mean, the first book, it's got that photograph at the back that Melinda took during the rehearsals at the Bridewell Theatre in 1994, which was a very strange picture that shows me, yes, with a kind of gauze material that is floating from the background and covering me, and which wasn't actually there when she took the picture. So the length of floating phosphorescent curtain, I have made that character in the Great Wen, just because I wanted to sort of, make these two things kind of connect up together. Um, I wouldn't mind some sort of connection between the recorded pieces, possibly, and the books, but I've not thought it through very much yet. Who knows what will happen in future? I suppose that within reasonable bounds, I'm up for anything really. But
Absolutely.
but yes, thank you for enjoying the recorded works.
Well, and speaking of that, given how collaborative your previous career was, Jason asks, have you ever considered any collaboration when it comes to prose itself, or is that something that interests you now?
That would be difficult. I mean, even with the Bumper Book of Magic, which was written by me and Steve Moore, we made the decision very early on that every word in the book should be mine. that because I've got a fairly distinctive style, and we thought that it would be best if the style was even throughout. What Steve's invaluable contribution to the collaboration was discussing all of the ideas when they were in the formative stages and doing all of the difficult research, which I myself was too lazy to do. Steve was digging up all of this stuff, and there wasn't a word in there or a phrase that we didn't discuss thoroughly before I typed it up. So it was very much a joint enterprise. I don't know how it would work to collaborate with another writer, that they write a bit and you write a bit. It might work, but I've got no real plans for it, and I probably too much. I selfishly enjoy having complete control over an entire world. That said, of course, I do enjoy collaboration and did enjoy collaboration with a number of my collaborators during my comics days, and that was a wonderful thing to see your descriptions turned into beautiful vistas. But at the same time, just having it all my own work, being responsible for all of it, that does feel quite good.
Perfect. And we are just approaching the top of the hour. You've already been very generous with your time today. So I'll close with one more question, and then I'll turn things over to you folks if you have any closing comments, and then return myself. Leo asks, I've heard you talking about communicating with your characters, how they sometimes talk back to you. How do you know when to listen to them?
Uh, Always listen to them because they know better than you do. They're obviously aspects of your unconscious which seldom gets anything wrong. Um, when they don't really talk to you, that would probably be a bit schizophrenic. But sort of what they do is you're thinking of something to do with them, and you'll suddenly think, no, that they wouldn't do that, would they? They wouldn't do that. Not that the characters I've created them and I know them, they would never do that. Also, um, there was a thing in the second book where um, I had to get uh, a character. I had to explain one of these breached books that I talked about so much in The Great When. These books that shouldn't exist in our world and yet somehow turn up in it and cause all sorts of problems. I had to explain how one of them had got from the Great When to our world. And I thought, yeah, how did that happen? Who would have possibly done that? And I suddenly realized that a character from the first book had almost incidentally confessed to having done that. But I hadn't realized that when I was writing it. But looking back, I suddenly found a couple of little phrases and I thought, oh, yes, of course, it was them. Nobody will be expecting that because I wasn't. Um, that's when characters, they tell you something that is just irresistible. And also on a closing note, that sort of I recently heard talking about the Joe Meek material in the second book. I recently had an extraordinary letter from a woman called Elena Duke, who lives in Northampton, who is the widow of a person called Robbie Duke, who was formerly known as Patrick Pink, who was Joe Meek's studio assistant and the last person to see him alive. And so the fact that she lives in Northampton, she loved the Great When, we're going to get in touch. But she told me that her husband used to reminisce about days working in the studio with Joe down at Holloway Road, where there was a part-time worker, apparently, in the studio in late 1966 and early 1967, who was just stacking tapes, keeping things tidy, things like that. And his name was Dennis, surname unknown. So, I mean, if that's not a gift from the universe, I don't know what is. Um, yeah, you know, that's uh, that's about it for that.
Thank you very much. I wasn't sure if you folks had any closing comments you might like to offer before I just close it down myself.
Um, I've been it's been a delightful evening. So thank you both very much, and thanks to everybody out there for sending in your lovely questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to answer more of them.
I just wanted to say thank you for lending us your time, and I'm so excited to continue following Dennis wherever he might go and whatever experiences he has. I'll be there.
Well, thank you. I shall be getting back as soon as I finish this call. I'll be getting back to the second book. Dennis is in real trouble at the moment, so I don't want to leave him there too long. You know.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Thank you, Matthew, for your hosting this afternoon or evening. Thank you all for your attention, for your questions, for your comments. We'll be sure to share those along at the end as well. And it's really been a privilege to spend this afternoon slash evening with you, Alan Moore. So thank you very much for being here.
Well,
Uh,
thank you all for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to Bloomsbury. Thank you to Raincoast. Wherever you are in this world, please have a wonderful day. The book is The Great When. You should buy as many copies of it as you can carry. It is superlative. Take care.